So this is by far one of my favorite phrases in the acting world, because on the one hand I hear teachers, directors, casting agents, so many using it and variations on it all the time, and they are staunch supporters of this phrase. And on the other hand, actors hear it and they seem to love it too. Because when you have someone like Anthony Hopkins, one of our most acclaimed actors ever to live, saying, "The art of acting is not to act. Once you show them more, what you will show them is in fact bad acting." Or Eric Morris, a well-established name in the coaching world, publishing a best-selling book called No Acting Please. Or Harold Guskin's extremely popular How to Stop Acting. Or when Todd Taylor from the Atlantic Theater Acting School in 2013 said on Backstage.com as his great secret advice to actors, less is more. So when you hear things like that, you begin to think there might actually be something to this whole non-acting thing. The best type of acting isn't really acting. It's something else. And all of these people are helping you as an actor by telling you that. Because, no, that's not a helpful thing to say to actors, ever. And it's a really foolish thing to base your acting on for several reasons. And the first is that the phrase itself doesn't actually talk about anything specific. But what's more, it can't. It can only exist in a general, blanket phrase sort of way. And the reason is the second you try and make it specific, you see how totally absurd and nonsensical it is, because it becomes self-canceling. You can't tell someone they do their best acting when they're not acting, because they can't be acting when they're not acting.
Yeah, what does acting without acting mean?
It just means that, you don't want to see the actor at work.
Right.
You want to hide the technique. It's acting. It's doing the job. It's the craft. So you hide the actor's effort.
But he's still acting.
Yeah, of course you're acting.
Right. So it could be acting with acting. That could be a title, too. Yeah. Yeah.
It is without act. I mean, it's hiding the acting.
Right, it's hiding the acting, and yet it's all acting.
Most of it.
Yeah.
The self-refuting nature of the statement isn't the point. It's the problem. The statement negates itself. It means nothing, and so it can mean anything. This actually is a problem for you as an actor and has some clever consequences if you believe in this phrase, which I'll get to in a moment. But let's keep with the statement itself and break some of its properties down. Acting, be it good or bad, can be boiled down to a series of actions that exist. Whatever it is you call acting, it is physical in nature and it must exist. And when I say it's physical, I'm not giving preferential treatment to styles of acting that identify as physical instead of ones more imagination-based. I really mean it literally. Physically, it exists. Well, then the claim the statement is making is that you can only recognize something physical by its absence. And also the highest quality is determined by how absent it is.
Right.
First, I know of nothing you can observe based on absence. You could infer something based on a current condition, but that's slightly different. For example, you could say that we observe breathing based on when someone is not breathing. But really what we're recognizing first are other physical states. From there, we infer that what is absent is breath, which may be true, unless we've made an error in judgment, which happens even in simple examples like, is someone breathing or not? You can't see acting when it's not there, because it is literally not there. If you see it and associate it with acting in your mind, then you are still observing what you categorize as acting. This is important because when it comes to determining quality, how good the acting is, then that quality has to be determined by some level of quantity. In other words, if I had an empty plate and said the food is delicious, then I would be talking about things that don't exist. If you say that the best acting is not acting, you are making up something that is not there. But here you'll probably say, it's not about there not being any acting at all. I'm just being too literal with the phrase. It's more about not being too much or over the top, or whatever phrase you'd like to use. Except there's a slight issue with that, because that interpretation of the phrase indicates more specific measurements, such as a point when we know the acting is too much versus when it's just right. Well, if the whole acting, non-acting phrase is just a shorthand, a verbal placeholder to talk about those things, like too much acting or being too over the top, then the phrase itself misrepresents what it talks about. Acting or non-acting are definites. They refer to states of existence, not percentages on a continuum. That means the phrase is more metaphorical and fluid. It can change based on the context and the person using it. Why this makes a difference for you as actors is if the phrase itself doesn't really mean anything, it can mean anything. If a director comes up to you and says, "Stop acting," they're using that phrase as if its inherent meaning is understood to get you to do something. But there is no inherent meaning to this phrase. It relies on you assuming your intuitions about the phrase match up with the director's or teacher's. They're notorious for saying things like, "The worst thing is to see an actor acting." But you've come to an acting class. You've paid to learn acting. You plan to live as an actor. And so when your entire concept about acting and not acting is disabled in favor of something more vague and metaphorical, it cancels out your ability to have clear guidelines and criteria for what is expected of you. This is when semantics without meaning becomes a tool to justify whatever the teacher wants you to do. For example, in acting classes, you sometimes get told things like, "Stop being so result-oriented." And then one of the pieces of feedback you get might be, "Stop acting so much." But that's an inherently result-oriented instruction. But what you don't get is a clear definition of what it really means. Because by any logical standards, you wouldn't be rewarded more for doing less of what you are rewarded for.
It's not true. That's impossible.
Search your feelings. You know it to be true.
A phrase like that places you entirely at the command of the person making the demand, since they control the criteria. They'll be able to tell you when you're acting and criticize you for it, but also when you're not acting, which then becomes good acting sometimes. And in between that is everything they want you to do, say, sometimes put up with. But here's where this issue has to go, which is even if you do succeed in attaining that state of non-acting, how is that going to work out long term? Because presumably, if you adopt these new non-acting habits into your repertoire, your toolbox, then they're no longer about non-acting, but have become acting skills. But wasn't acting the problem in the first place? And you paid all that money to be told, "Stop acting," so you could use it for acting. Well, given the fine line, surely those habits eventually run the risk of becoming acting in the wrong way, but how will you know? All the phrase leaves you with is the knowledge that sometimes acting means good work, and sometimes it means bad work, and rarely, if ever, are you in charge of determining that. Now what you can always say is, yes, it might not mean anything on the surface, but it's not about being literal. This is a metaphorical phrase to use for artistic inspiration, and you know intuitively what it means. To which I say, bullshit.
Sweet evil Jesus. What did he say? Ethical, my aching ass.
Because intuitions aren't clear. They're not easy to talk about, and they're often wrong. We just happen to forget when our instincts are incorrect. Some people have genuine intuitions that they'll go to the casino and win big, or that the plane certainly will crash, killing everyone. But the second the plane lands, or the house cleans out, however, intuition gone. Now, of course, you could say, well, those are issues about addiction and mental health disorders. Except they're still intuitive predictions about real-world results. They come before those societal labels we want to give them, like addiction and mental health. Those don't discredit how real the intuitions feel when they arise. Instincts can be, and often are, wrong. The reality is people use a phrase like, "The best acting is not acting," or something like that in classes, rehearsal rooms, on set, in workshops, as justification for asking you to do things. That doesn't mean they're always malicious or nefarious, but sometimes you are asked to do things that cross personal boundaries for you, or pay money, or make career-impacting decisions. Well, your resources are precious, and so those are all rather big things for you. And with the phrase being able to change from situation to situation based on intuitions, that seems a little too vague to be basing practical decisions off of, even if it fits the intuitions, or for a better word, opinions the director or coach or whoever might have about what is best for you. Because a vague, nonsensical statement like that can only make sense if you accept that the person using the metaphor to talk about something specific is using it in the exact same way you interpret it. Otherwise, you're talking about two different things. And I don't mean, well, we're both talking about acting, therefore we're talking about the same thing. No, I'm talking about what in that moment, in that context, is the phrase being used to discuss. One of the best phrases used in behavioral research methods that I've ever heard is if there's no compelling evidence for what someone asks you to believe, you aren't obligated to believe it. Actors, I invoke that phrase here. Opinions and metaphors are a form of evidence, but they're not very good. And with your precious resources, I think you do better not basing your decisions and taking instructions from people on just such flimsy evidence.